This is Tyler Prochazka, the features editor for Basic Income Earth Network's Basic Income News. This is the UBI podcast, and I'm joined today by Daniel F., who is a PhD student at UCLA. He's studying computational nanotechnology. And I invited Daniel to join the podcast today because he wrote a really interesting article about um, libertarianism and uh, gave sort of a shout out to basic income. And I wanted to kind of probe what his feelings were on those two philosophies. So, Daniel, can you first sort of give the audience a rundown of what your article was about?
Great, thank you. So the basic idea that I was trying to get across in my article is, so obviously as governments get very big and intrusive, that leads to less freedom for most people. You have something like fascism or communism. But what I was arguing was that if you go very far in the other direction to something like extreme levels of libertarianism, I think that also leads to less freedom for most individuals in society, at least freedom in a meaningful way. Not necessarily just freedom from the government, but freedom to pursue various actions that you might want to pursue. And so that was the main point that I guess I was trying to get across on my piece.
And so, and I have similar feelings, I guess, about a lot of libertarians. I think that I think that they're right in a lot of aspects, and I think they're, especially when it comes to corporate subsidies, they're actually better than probably the Republicans or Democrats. They're pretty consistent, but I think what they get wrong is that they think there's this assumption that there's an even playing field from the get go. So I'm wondering. What would you say to those libertarians that they think it's there's that big debate about you didn't build that. For libertarians, that was really offensive. What would you say to libertarians that say, it's an even playing field, everyone should keep the wealth that they produce? What kind of viewpoints do you have towards that view of libertarians?
Well, I think there's a few things that you brought up there, but just the idea that it's an even playing field, I think as it's a lot of it, it's not really an even playing field, even in negotiations between employers and employees, and that's because people have basic needs that they have to get met, or else they die. And if you have, like, the analogy that I like to draw, which I put in my piece, was that if I held like a gun to your head and told you you had to work for a factory, what would you do?
I would work for the factory.
Right. And if there's 5 factories and I held a gun to your head and said, well, you can work for any of them, but it has to be one of them, you're
Right.
still going to work for one of them. And if that's the situation, even if you come to a deal with, like, you're free to choose which one, but you're not really free. And if we had that exact situation where, like, someone held a gun to your head, legally the contract wouldn't be valid. You'd be under what's known as duress. And basically, if you have a society with no or very few safety nets, that's basically the power dynamic between employers and employees, and no one's acting in bad faith. I'm not saying that the employers are evil, but there is an uneven power dynamic, and I think that the contracts are almost inherently exploitative, at least for people who are living hand to mouth.
And so I want to kind of bring this to the basic income. I consider myself libertarian and in the Georgia sense, and I know that there's a lot of libertarians out there that do support a basic income. I'm wondering, do you think that with a basic income you remove that power dynamic, or is it just one step in a large a larger movement of improving other safety nets. How far does basic income go towards resolving that issue in your mind?
Well, I think if basic income is large enough to satisfy people's basic needs, it actually goes like a very long way to correcting for that. Because I think what ultimately happens then is you don't have a do or die situation. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about basic income. I've heard people say that, like, well, if we have basic income, no one's going to work. That doesn't make sense to me, because most people I know want more from life and also just more from their finances than simply living marginally above the poverty line. Most people would like a fair bit more luxury than that, so they would still work. But if what you're telling someone is, okay, your options are to work 16 hours a day, 6 days a week in a factory, and we'll pay you very little money to do that, or to not work. Like, if you gave me that situation, I'd choose not to work at all. And because I'd be able to walk away from the table, at least, I think that would give it allows more bargaining, and that I think makes the negotiation more fair.
So one other issue that I've run into with right-leaning libertarians is they sort of don't really pay much attention to negative externalities, or if they do, it's not really on the top of their list of issues. For example, I mean, pollution or carbon,
right? Yeah,
those sort of things. And I'm wondering, do you see basic income as a way to resolve those issues? Do you think it's appropriate, for example, to have a dividend from carbon emissions?
Well, I mean, I think that would be a great way to pay for it. I'm obviously not sure how much money you get from a carbon tax, and how much whether that would be enough for basic income. But one area that I agree with libertarians a lot with, actually, is I think market-based solutions they tend to be much more effective than the alternative of central planning. I like to look at it actually as if like the market is almost like an algorithm, like what a computer might use to solve a problem. And I think it tends to be better at finding solutions than central planning. But you have to ask it the right question. You have to make sure it's solving the problem you want to solve. And if you don't have things like taxes and subsidies for externalities, then you're not solving a problem that allocates resources and jobs in accordance so much, completely with how society would want, because there are people who get who are negatively affected by exchanges that don't have any say in them.
So, how for libertarians that are in favor of a basic income, how much in agreement are you with them then generally on the rest of their host of policies?
For libertarians that do want basic income,
do you think that philosophy is something that makes sense to you, of generally allowing the market to be free, but giving people a basic income to have the choice of participating in it or not?
So I think that's a lot better than libertarians who don't who don't want a basic income. My largest qualm with someone who's libertarian who doesn't want a basic income would be the fact that there are probably zero safety nets in their model, which means there's likely to be a lot of poverty, and also a good chance a lot of people would die from things like starvation. That wouldn't. I mean, there still are certain areas where I think government intervention can be good. For instance, for public goods, it's probably good that the government builds roads. I think it's also good that the government invests in things like scientific research, like medical research. So certain areas where, for various reasons, the private sector might not be you know, as poised to handle as the government. But I mean, but I do think there are other ways where libertarians are advocating for more sensible policies than what other, major parties are advocating for. So it's, I guess, for libertarians that want basic income, I'm in agreement with a lot of what they want, but not everything.
Sure. So, and one thing that a lot of libertarians will say to me is that private charity is a lot more effective than government social services. Do you generally think that's true? Do you buy the idea that government providing social services crowds out private charity, or what's your view on that issue?
Actually, I'd assume that really depends on the charity because I'm not sure. Are you familiar with GiveWell? Have you heard of them?
Uh, no, I'm not sure.
GiveWell is a charity evaluator. They look at the impact that different charities have, and they have, according to their analysis, charities can vary in their effectiveness by about a factor of like 1,000 or more. Um, so I think there are some charities that are very effective. I think the problem, I mean, I'd imagine that the government would generally only crowd out charities in an area if they actually solve the problem completely, which, um, you know, plausibly is a good thing. But what I worry about is if you just rely on charity, there might not be enough of it for a lot of the problems. And then additionally, there's a lot of charitable areas that I'd imagine ma- many people there just might not be the interest in. So like, cancer research is obviously very popular for charitable donations. I'm not sure that a lot of people would want to donate to a charity that builds roads, even though that's a very important public good. It's not something that, I don't think most rich people would feel very passionate about, even though it's this good. So if you are depending on charity, you're more at the whims of what individuals, especially very wealthy individuals, want to do and want their legacy to be. And there isn't necessarily, an overarching force that's looking and making sure that everything fits together well.
And do you think that leads me to the other thing that libertarians will often say is, you can have a basic income done through a private organization.
Well, but then why haven't we had that? Why? I mean, if no one's stopping a private organization from doing basic income today, but we don't see it.
So, I think you're right. I mean, you do have like Give Directly that can do it in a place like
Like,
Africa.
sure, but no, and that is well. So it's actually funny you bring up Give Directly because the site I just mentioned, GiveWell, which evaluates charities, actually they rank Give Directly as one of the most effective charities, which is, in my mind, an argument for basic income.
Right.
But sure, it can work in Kenya, but how much money does Give Directly have versus how much money can the government have to for a safety net? It might work in Kenya because there's very large purchasing power, so you don't have to donate that much, and it goes very far. If you wanted, let's say, like in America, basic income to fulfill everyone's basic needs would be about $10,000 per adult per year, and if there's around 200 million adults, we're looking at about $2 trillion a year. I don't think we're going to see $2 trillion per year in donations anywhere. So,
And so you mentioned, I mean, the efficacy of Give Directly. Do you think that if the government were to get involved with something like a universal basic income, that it could be as effective? I mean, I have my own personal kind of suspicions about politicians getting into something like UBI because they typically want to put a bunch of conditions on things. Like you look at this push towards drug testing for welfare benefits, you have this push for food stamps to have all these regulations about what you can and cannot buy. So I'm worried about putting it up to the whims of politicians because uh, they also have their own ideas about what is good and what isn't for society. So it could become less universal and more paternalistic. Do you have that same fear?
Um, I mean, I think that is a possibility, but I'd probably look at Social Security because I think that's the closest thing we have in America to basic income. But presumably, if we had basic income, that would come with many of these other safety nets, like food stamps, subsidized housing, and so forth. It would come with um, those safety nets being closed down, partially to pay for the basic income. And I, I mean, basic income would have fewer of those hoops. The other thing that I think, and I think that's actually an argument in favor of it, is that it's not good to have all these tests and all these different programs and what you can and can't do. And basic income, in theory, wouldn't have that. But I also think that one reason why it might be less likely to have those is because basic income would go to everyone. And a lot of these means tests and limitations, I think oftentimes they're not effective, but the reason why they're put in there is because um, there are a lot of people that on some level want to blame poor people for being poor or want to shame poor people. And so they look at like food stamps and they think, okay, the people who are getting this, well, we want to make sure they're not just, lazy or something. Versus if you're giving basic income to everyone, then it's less of like it's less of a sentiment. I think many people would feel less of a sentiment of why do they get a handout that I don't get, and instead there could be more of a sentiment of, okay, we all get this, so it's fair and everyone can do whatever they want with it.
What do you say to the philosophical argument behind right libertarians? I mean, what they point out from what they believe is that redistribution inherently is immoral. They think that the only justifiable use of taxation is for security services to preserve your negative rights. That's the general idea behind right libertarians. What do you say to the philosophical argument?
Um, well, this is interesting because for me personally, I'm philosophically much more utilitarian. So I think that the rights we have, um, for instance, the right to property, right to free speech, I think that they're very, very important because um, they do allow our society to be a lot better. For instance, free speech, obviously gives the free exchange of ideas and allows better ideas to come to light. The right to property preserves order, allows for incentives for work, decreases in violence. But I don't personally look at these sorts of rights as um, well, I think they're very valuable instrumentally. I don't think that they're particularly valuable um, like as a base truth in and of themselves. So when the government is taxing, it obviously doesn't create the same tensions in society and lead to chaos the way that theft does. So I don't look at it as similar. To people who are more, I guess, ideological instead of utilitarian in their thinking, what I guess I'd say is like if it wasn't for the government, you wouldn't be able, if it wasn't for the government creating order and allowing you to not live in a state of nature, you wouldn't be able to have any wealth. You wouldn't be able, I mean, life would be chaos. And so giving something back to improve society and to improve other people's lives, even if it's not done voluntarily, you are getting something from the rest of the world, so it makes sense to give something back, I guess.
And so, at its core, what is your biggest disagreement then? I guess with right libertarians.
Well, so it depends, because obviously different people are going to have different motivations for believing what they believe, and people's views can't just be summed up with one label usually. But I'd imagine that philosophically, my biggest disagreement with right libertarians is that they seem to value more than anything else, lack of theft in all its various forms, whether that's through taxation or through physical aggression, versus my value more than anything else, I guess, would just be, human welfare, human flourishing, which, so it seems like there is an overarching difference in philosophy. Policy-wise, I think my largest disagreement would be that they have no safety net, and I would want there to be some safety net.
And do you? Another thing that I run into is that they say these types of programs will often be exploited or corrupted when it comes to social services. I mean, especially if you look at something like Medicaid, I think that's probably true. You have a lot of fraudulent administration of Medicaid. You have these fraudulent uh, medical services popping up for both Medicare and Medicaid. Do you see basic income as different? Do you think it would alleviate that problem, or do you think it would also be prone to fraud and corruption?
Well, I mean, I can't speak to the specifics of Medicaid and Medicare, but I think that basic income would probably have less of this than other programs, just because it is, if you have something like food stamps or subsidized housing, it's complicated. It's not too hard to imagine how you could either write in loopholes or how someone could take advantage of the system potentially. But versus if everyone gets a check for the same amount from the government, it's hard to see how that exactly leads to fraud. I mean, might there be a couple instances that's plausible, but I'd imagine it could be done in a way where there was such a small rate of fraud that would be negligible.
And another interesting point that I've sort of thinking about again, I've run into a few times over the years, is they point to, a lot of people will point to rentier states, where they have this windfall of resources, and for example Saudi Arabia, and it when they distribute out that cash, it really does destroy civil society. And they also pointed to some Native American reservations where the revenue from, for example, their gambling services that gets distributed, and these windfalls go to these kids. They're 18, and they were documenting how they have no financial management skills, and so they're spending, they're throwing out $50 bills on just like crap, basically, just garbage. And so I'm wondering, do you think, I guess a couple things. First, do you see a basic income as generally running into that problem of creating something like a situation where we see in rentier states where people legitimately do stop engaging with society? And second, do you think that there's a risk that a lot of people will mismanage their basic income?
Um, well, I mean, I'd imagine that it probably wouldn't be set at a high enough level where that would particularly be a worry. If if you have enough where you're just above the poverty line, I don't think that affords you enough money to go and blow it all on um, whatever hot item you want. But um, I mean, I could see potentially some problems occurring if it was implemented all at once. I'd actually would probably prefer it to be somewhat slowly phased in. I think I think there's a tendency people have to want abrupt change, and I think it's usually better, especially economically, to slowly phase in policies so that you don't have a jarring transition period. I think there was another part of your question was.
Do you see as I guess going back to the rentier states, do you think that you mentioned that it's not enough to disengage? At what I guess at what level do you think it would uh, induce disengagement from society?
Well, so here's what's one thing that's interesting is actually if you look at the rich, I mean the rich largely do have a basic income. They don't have it from the government, but they get passive income from their investments. There are a lot of people, and not even just people who are wealthy. There's um, a large portion of society where the where their parents of often of millennials give them help them out a little bit, give them some money for rent or for certain other things that they might not be able to cover given their paycheck. And by and large, if you look at you look at the rich, they haven't become lazy because they're able to live off their interest. And there's all sorts of media articles about how millennials are lazy, but I mean, I think that's mostly spin. I don't think millennials are probably any lazier than any other than the previous generations. Um, if if you give people, I think, a lot of money when they're really young, like 14 or 16, if you gave them millions of dollars, I think that could very easily change their worldview. But um, I don't think that I don't think that giving an adult $10,000 a year would cause them to check out. At what point would they? That obviously depends on the person, but I think I saw a study at one point that where they tried something like basic income, and it was over a short period, but they found that the recipients did there was a very small decrease in the average amount worked, but almost all of the people who worked less, it was it was basically all two groups: students and new parents. And honestly, if students work less to focus more on their studies, and new parents work less to spend time with their infants, those seem like good things. So I don't I don't think that we're really at a risk of that.
I think you're referencing the New Jersey graduated income
Yeah,
workforce.
I think it was that.
Yeah. So and what I say very similar things. It was that single mothers that and mothers in general, they decrease their work hours slightly, in order to spend more time with their children. I'm very confused how anyone thinks that that's a net worse for society. But I am curious what you think, if there needs to be sort of a cultural foundation then for something like basic income. You mentioned phasing in, so you have to sort of adjust to it. But um, do you think that in during the adjustment period, there has to be an emphasis on contributing to society? I read one basic income advocate said that when at the point where you get your basic income, you should meet with the leadership of the town, or leaders in the in your education um, organizations, and you basically sign a contract, and you write a letter of intent for how you're going to contribute to society. You don't have to actually do it, but you meet with them and you sort of work out these ideas. So I'm wondering, do you think that that should be a bigger focus of basic income advocates, of sort of changing the culture, and making sure that there's more of an emphasis on contributing to society as we push for basic income?
Well, I think that America already has a pretty strong culture on valuing work. You had mentioned Saudi Arabia earlier, and it's interesting. I mean, the culture in America and Saudi Arabia are obviously vastly different. And um, if you go to countries throughout Europe, um, they typically get 4 or 6 weeks off per year, versus Americans typically get 2, oftentimes less. And I think that insofar as it's really hard to um, manipulate culture. I'm very like dubious of by law any sort of government attempt to try to manipulate culture by having someone sort of pledge to do something. Presumably, once we had basic income, it would be something that the same way that parents tend to give their children advice, they hopefully would give them advice relevant to it. Presumably, it would get brought up at some point in the education system. Um, but I'm not sure. I mean, most people make more money than what they'd get from basic income anyway. And so I'm not really sure. I mean, I guess more than anything, the message I'd hope people would have about it would be that treat this the same way you treat your other income. So don't look at this as I know sometimes people, when they um, get windfall money for some reason, they might be more inclined to spend it quicker. So I'd hope that they treat the money from basic income the same way they would the money from their job.
And so there's a couple more questions. The first is, as you study computational nanotechnology, so you're familiar with the kind of push for automation and the utilization of robots and AI, and I'm sure all these this cluster of technologies that's replacing human jobs. Do you think that that makes something like basic income inevitable? Is that what drew you to basic income initially?
Actually, I don't think it makes it inevitable, but I think that the alternatives are quite poor. I think that the what I think the most likely alternative would be we just create a bunch of bullshit jobs. Um, this could either be government jobs, um, which basically would be basic income, but with the strings attached that you have to waste 40 hours per week doing something that a robot could do very easily.
Absolutely.
And that's a waste. Or it's possible that I think there could be jobs where, I mean, even if basically everything is automated, there might be a desire um, for certain products that like are made by a human, or you know services that are provided by a human instead of a robot. And if I mean the difference between them could be very small, but you what you might see if we didn't have basic income would be people had to do those jobs, and then the rich would pay for them. And there's likely to be markets for those sorts of jobs anyway, but it would be, in my mind, a good thing that once robots can do all the labor, that we shouldn't force people to work. That, really people then should be free to choose not to. Um, so I really hope we get basic income then. And in fact, I'd hope that we'd get it before then, because I'm a little worried that if we don't get basic income before there is a lot of automation, you could see a bunch of automation comes, then jobs are largely replaced with some sort of bullshit jobs in some manner or another. But then the system could be so well entrenched that people might be saying, well, we don't need a basic income. Everyone's employed by the government doing, being security guards, or, whatever. And
I think what you're saying now is actually is a really persuasive argument for libertarians. I couldn't agree more. I think the danger is there's going to be some government intervention. That's inevitable, because people
right.
are going to call for the government to solve this issue, because the market isn't going to do it alone. And we're either going to get something efficient and like the UBI, or we're going to have this mess of programs. We're going to go the same way that we've always went, with all these conditions and strings, and it's going to be even worse than what we have now. So I'm really nervous, because I agree with you. I think the tendency is that we will go the way of the past. So I also want to ask, just really quickly. I just did a podcast with a school choice advocate, and I'm kind of curious your perspective on libertarians that push for more cash grants for things like educations and health services, to universalize that, so everybody has more direct power over their health and their education spending for their kids. Do you see something like health savings account and education savings account that's provided as a cash grant from the government? Do you see that as something along the lines of the basic income, or do you are you nervous about those types of privatizations of public goods?
I think it really depends on the good. I'm actually, with those two in particular, I'm actually a little nervous about the idea of privatization for slightly different reasons. So I'm worried for education that if you have um, privatization, most private schools in America are religious schools, and if someone wants to send their kid to religious school, I think that's fine. But if I think it's bad if the only good options for someone educationally are religious. I think there should be good secular school options. And so I'm worried that in a lot of areas, if you gave families money to make their own education choices, then what that could lead to is a lot of families would take that and send their kids to private schools, and that could lead to the public schools being very poor, and then you might have the only good options are religious. So I think I think school choice is actually a very complicated issue. With regards to healthcare, personally, I actually would prefer single payer. I think that healthcare is one area where uh, there's so much information and it's so hard to understand the playing field. And then additionally, I think that people are somewhat systematically irrational on evaluating things that have very low probability. And this is why a lot of people gamble. I think it's also why some people don't have health insurance, even if they can afford it and, probably should get it. And so I think it would be due to the systematic irrationality. I think the government should probably step in and provide it. Personally, though, so I think those are probably public goods that the government should provide. I think many of the safety nets, though, should be done away with, and instead have basic income. So if we had a good basic income, I'd probably want to get rid of welfare, obviously, food stamps, subsidized housing, minimum wage, certain laws about collective bargaining, so on and so forth.
So you just named you gave me a lot of
right. Okay, so most of the safety nets I would want to get rid of if we had basic income, but probably not public education. Probably not. Well, we don't have single payer, but I think single payer would be better than what we have.
Well,
now.
I mean, honestly, what we have now is just
it's a mess.
To both worlds. Honestly,
yeah.
We need to decide what we want to do. If we want to have a market-based healthcare system, let's do it. Or if we're going to have single payer, let's do it. We're trying to tiptoe around it, but
yeah, it's a mess, and politics makes it impossible because of special interests and all that.
I mean, but I could debate with you for a long time on ESAs and HSAs, but I won't get into all that. I just want to ask you one last question because I want to have a critic of basic income, libertarian critic of basic income on the UBI podcast. And so I'm wondering if you could ask a libertarian critic of UBI one specific question, what would it be?
That's a good question. Well, I guess I think a lot of one thing that I hear a lot of libertarians say is something along the lines of like, well, the free market will solve such and such problem anyway. But then at the same time, they'll often say, well, even if it doesn't, it's still, even if the government could solve this problem, it still would be immoral for them to do that because they'd have to tax, and that's theft, and that's just wrong. So I guess I'd kind of want to ask them the hypothetical of like, if you knew that basic income would decrease poverty drastically, and so you have to choose between a lot of people are in poverty, many of them are starving, or but you do have to raise taxes to do that. Or sorry, but there are lower taxes and people are in poverty, or you have basic income and it does solve the problem. Which would you choose? So because that, I guess, sort of I think that's interesting because that separates libertarians into those who philosophically very much believe in libertarianism no matter what, versus those who just who just believe that it's the best strategy for dealing with some of our problems.
Yeah, and I think that libertarians that are sort of rigid around that aren't. I get frustrated with that because it doesn't really do them any. It doesn't do their goals any good because nobody's gonna cut food stamps. Nobody's gonna cut minimum wage if you don't have a basic income. I think they're not even strategically very very wise in the way that they're kind of choosing their goals.
Right. I think, yeah, you have to live in the real world. And in the real world, I mean, look, even Donald Trump says he's not going to touch Social Security. So, like, it's not. I mean, they couldn't even repeal Obamacare. If they can't repeal Obamacare, they can't repeal Social Security or food stamps.
The Republic. Oh man, I don't want to get too much into American politics because it frustrates me a lot. But I want to give you a chance to introduce how to the audience how they can find you and follow you online.
Right. So I have a blog where I blog about mostly about technology and economics and a lot of how they interrelate. The blog is called thinkingofutils.com. Utils is spelled UTILS. And the reason why I created this blog is I feel like there's a lot written about technology, a lot written about economics, but usually when people write about the intersection, they understand maybe one of the two areas, but not both. And I think that they do interrelate in a lot of ways. So it is important to understand both of them. And so if you're interested in reading some of my posts, then come check out my blog.
All right, thank you so much, Daniel. And I want to emphasize that today's podcast does not necessarily reflect that of Basic Income News or Basic Income Earth Network. I want to thank Daniel again, and I hope to get to talk to you again soon.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Daniel.